Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. So this video preparation hasn't quite gone as I expected. My plan was to take this out for its first race meeting, come back, make a video, tell you all about how things went. That hasn't quite gone to plan. The speed controller broke on my second run, so my observations on how this car actually drives are quite limited. But rather than wait several weeks before I get out to another race meeting, I thought I'd do a quick summary of how the XRAY XB2C 2024 carpet edition actually goes together. So some details on the build, some information on the kit setup, and a few quick observations just from around about 8 minutes driving. So first things first, a few general observations about the build. The build is good. There are a couple of parts that maybe aren't up to the high standards you might expect from an X-Ray, but having said that, the vast majority of parts go together really well. X-Ray are generally very good at making a car that goes together very precisely without any unnecessary slop and with parts that you would expect to be quite strong. Looking at it as an overview as well, this body shell, which I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of when I looked at that in the clear Lexan, actually works fine when it's painted. It's got a lot of detail on it, but with a simple paint job like I do, I haven't done it perfectly as usual. There's always room for improvement on that, but it doesn't look too bad on the track, quite aggressive, fits very well. And the other general observation about this kit is that it is pretty lightweight out of the box. I've added quite a lot of ballast to this just to get it up to the minimum weight limit, which is a surprise, and in part that's because of choices X-Ray have made with the spec of the kit. Again, I'm going to mention that as I go through parts of the car in more detail. One final thing I'd like to mention about this is that X-Ray are quite generous in that they do include some optional parts in the box. Because this is the carpet kit, it does come with the alternative gearbox for the rear, which allows you to move the motor back. Also comes with the alternative disengaged rear suspension arms, which have slightly different mounting positions and shorten the wheelbase. So both of those are aimed at lower grip conditions. Also includes a full set of 2-dot springs, which are again a slightly softer spring than the 3 dots that the carpet build uses. And again, that's aimed at giving you a car that you can adapt to lower grip conditions with no extra cost or no extra parts needed. So if we take a look at the front end of the build in a bit more detail, obviously the first thing you notice on this car compared to previous X-Rays is that they've gone for the reversed front shock tower, just like an associated car, which does give you the benefit of this protector across the front. Certainly that's useful on carpet. Some tracks would ask for a protector to be fitted anyway over the old style with the screws facing forward. Slightly harder to access the nuts for if you want to make shock adjustments, but not really a big deal in the scheme of things. The front wing is attached here, fairly standard design, not particularly wide, but fairly standard scoop front wing for a 2-wheel drive car. One feature that I do like about the X-Rays, just a personal thing, is that I do like that they've actually stuck with a straight wishbone with dropped down mounting points to give you that gull wing effect that most of the other buggies have. The gull wing, of course, is to mean that you can mount the actual top of the shocks lower to the ground. This for me is just useful in eyeballing ride height and eyeballing roll center, so that's a feature that I'm quite glad they've retained on this car. The suspension arms are the same basic shape as on the previous generations of car. They have introduced a medium material for these though, which is a little softer than before. Also, another thing to note about the front end is that the way that X-Ray have got the adjustable hub height on the front is that there's not as large a range in the adjustment as there is on other cars in the market, such as the Associated and the Yokomo. Not necessarily a problem, just something to be aware of. Again, generally I would be running this high hub for high grip conditions with low ride heights, and the low hub for lower grip conditions with higher ride heights. And the last thing to sort of mention really about the front end here is the shock absorbers. They are of course a 13.2mm big bore design, new for this car, and the vast majority of the shock goes together very nicely. In particular, the seals have very little friction on the shock shafts, so they're very smooth when they've been assembled. The main weakness, unfortunately, is these shock caps, which just a bit off as a moulding. I'm not really sure what's going on, maybe a bit of a Friday moulding from X-Ray, but I would say that when you assemble the car, pay close attention to the bleed hole at the top. The bleed hole is a little bit undersized for the bleeding screw, so I think the cleanest solution would be to try to find an M2 tap to tap out that hole in the first instance to make the very small screw go in more easily. There's a few other things you can do to make a screw go in more easily. I won't mention them. I'm sure you've got your own preferred techniques of doing that. The good thing is, though, that if you do strip the head of one of these 1.5mm hex head screws, the good news is that if you've got a 1/16 of an inch old style Imperial Allen driver, then that will go into a stripped 1.5mm head quite nicely. And that in fact is what I've ended up doing with all of these screws to make sure that they go all the way in and come back out again, because two of them I couldn't finish doing with the standard tool because the hole was so tight. The other thing to mention about them is that they don't really thread on that cleanly. They need a couple of goes to get on, so again, just be careful with that. First couple of times I screwed them down, they were actually a thread or two short of being all the way down, so just pay close attention to that on the front shocks. Also, while we're at the front of the car, you'll find that the standard position for the servo mounts is a little bit far forward, and what seems to happen for a lot of people is that the servo horn will actually make contact with the steering rack instead of allowing it to move freely. So what I've ended up having to do is to mount the servo in the rearward hole and then add, as you can see, a lot of spacers. There are some spacers included in the kit, but that is all of them, with some additional screws that are longer, because obviously you need a longer screw when you've got all those spacers on there, and also having to, because it's a low profile servo, having to cut down one of the servo mounts quite a lot to have clearance for the cable. This does sort of give the right kind of angle on the linkage. As you can see, the linkage is roughly 90 degrees at the neutral position. I'm pretty much happy with that. One other nice thing about this steering setup as well, actually, compared to the Associated and Yokomo cars I have, is that it does seem a little bit more precise, both the Associated and the Yokomo, with the plastic components that you get as standard are quite sloppy, and this has got just that little extra degree of precision in it. We'll see how it goes after it's had a few runs, but it kind of installs a little bit more confidence in the accuracy of the steering without wanting to go out and buy any optional parts. In terms of the electronics install, this is all pretty standard for a modern two-wheel drive buggy. You do have the option in the X-Ray, and I do feel this is a bit of a penny pinch on their part. They don't include any plates to go under the servo or under the speed controller. So as standard, you are attaching the speed controller direct to the chassis. The good thing is that because they've gone for this fairly wide chassis design, rather like the Associated B6.4, you've got plenty of room for your electronics. This is a very old Futaba fast receiver, which is quite a lot bigger than what a lot of people run. Still fits in there just fine. Also plenty of space there for the standard capacitor pack on this Hobbywing speed controller. Also space in this particular case for quite a lot of ballast. So these are steel wheel weights. There's 40 grams of ballast there to get this up to weight. Had X-Ray included their steel plates to go under the servo and under the speed controller, I don't think I'd have needed anywhere near as much ballast, so that's potentially an option part to buy for a kind of a cleaner installation, but this does work. No concerns about putting steel weights on it if you need to get up to the minimum racing weight. As usual with the LiPo, again, this is a ultra low profile 4200 LiPo. It does have a 35 gram brass plate under it as well, again to help with the weight, but there's plenty of adjustment on the battery mounts. It's the style with the rotating sections here that just hold the battery in place, and this works very nicely with plenty of adjustment. Because this is a screw fitting here, you've also got a lot of adjustments here, and there are holes in the side rails, which means you can bring the battery right up forward to this point if you wanted to, also bringing it a lot closer to the motor again if you wanted to. There's mounting holes here, which is where you would put a fan. There's a molded fan mount that comes in the kit. You could add a fan there. You can also add a fan there if you want to, a 30mm fan. I haven't done that. I don't tend to automatically run a fan on a motor, but it's something that I could do. I think that probably I'd need to move this battery forward in order to fit a fan in that gap, so that's just something to bear in mind. And again, the motor fits in as you would expect, a censored motor, and this is the gearbox that has the forward position, which is the one that's best suited to carpet. Another area where X-Ray maybe aren't doing themselves any favours with the quality of the finish is actually in the chassis plate. It doesn't compare very well to, for example, the Yokomo chassis, which has a perfect finish and comes with a hard anodized coating. There is a lot of tooling marks on the chassis that X-Ray supply, which really isn't quite what you'd expect for the price. Also a couple of little marks on the bottom where you can see where they did the two processes for bending the chassis at the edges and then cutting the chassis. You've got a few little tooling marks on the edges there, which isn't quite the standard you might expect. No questions about the actual accuracy of the chassis. All the holes are in the right place, but kind of it doesn't feel as premium as you might expect. On this side of the motor, pretty standard installation. They have the slipper clutch and slipper clutch spring facing out, sort of the traditional way, which I actually find a lot easier to work with than the other cars that have the slipper spring on the opposite side of the gearbox. This is much easier to assemble, much easier to change spur if you need to. Goes together very well. Actually has quite a nice special nut on the end of the slipper rather than the standard nylock nuts that most other manufacturers use, which is just a nice little detail. And this is attached to a fairly standard gearbox arrangement for a modern buggy. Lay down with a forward motor. X-Ray have changed the rear gear diff for this generation of car, and the gear diff is what's fitted. It's now a slightly narrower gear diff, which means that you can run the same drive shafts regardless of whether you are running a gear diff or a ball diff. There's the anti-roll bar you can see there as well, which again is nice and precise. And these anti-roll bars in the kit are actually on the stiff side, so they actually work quite well, which is something you can't always say about every anti-roll bar on a buggy. In particular, the front anti-roll bar does definitely have more stiffness to it than what you would normally find in the kit on a two-wheel drive buggy. One sort of observation goes hand in hand with the fairly limited down travel on the shocks in the kit settings is that the drive shaft pins, I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but they are very close to the outside edge of the outdrives. And I think that if you were running more droop by changing the shock ends, you might want to, or you might have to, buy the alternative axles that X-Ray sell. There's some alternative axles that they do which move the mounting further away from the wheel, which means that the drive shaft pins go more to the center of the car, and that's probably going to be required at larger levels of droop to stop the drive shafts from falling out. In terms of rear geometry, again fairly standard, 3 degrees of toe with pills inserts to change the amount of toe. You could easily go down to 1 degree. With this, you also have the same range of adjustment on the anti-squat. The hubs, the rear hubs, have got lots of adjustment as well. So similar to most other two-wheel drive buggies, you have adjustment, quite fine adjustment in 1mm increments for the link on the top of the hub. Also, what they do with this, which is quite interesting to me, is as well as having vertical height on the rear hub, you actually have two different molded rear hubs, one which gives a lower roll center, one which gives a higher roll center. So in the carpet spec, you would build it with the high roll center hub, which is a lower hub physically. Overall, it gets a bit confusing. It's much easier if you actually see the parts in front of you. But they also use inserts in the bottom of the hub that allow adjustment of height of the hinge pin, but also you can offset the hinge pin inwards or outwards to adjust the width and the geometry of the car as well. And potentially that width adjustment is something you could use to stop the drive shafts from popping out. Obviously, you've also going to affect some other geometry if you change the width there, but that's just something to consider as well if you start to have problems with that. So let's talk a bit about the basic kit setup. So my rough observation was that it was quite conservative. It has 3 degrees of rear towing, for example, which will create a fairly planted rear end. Also, the springing on the rear is relatively softer than the front, not by a great deal, but another thing that's going to encourage stable handling. And that was kind of proven by my two short runs. The first run was not really worth commenting on. The track was completely green, there was no grip whatsoever, so lots of understeer. But by the time the first heat was running, the grip had come up a lot and the car was slightly understeer but very neutral. The main observation I had, apart from the slight mid-corner understeer, which I would maybe tackle with some changes to the rear toe, for example, was that it didn't land the jumps very well. So one thing to mention about the kit settings is that they don't have a huge amount of down travel with the way that these shocks are built as standard. X-Ray do some optional longer shock ends, which would allow you to get more downward travel, and I'd certainly expect that to help improve the handling across the bumps and also on landing from the jumps. But certainly a good start with scope for a few tweaks maybe around the front pistons and perhaps around the spring rates, just to get the car a little bit closer to where I would like it to be. But otherwise, very satisfying start, and although only 8 minutes on track, nothing broke. So that brings this video to an end. Hopefully you found this interesting. If you've got any questions or comments, then as ever, please do leave them below. Also, as ever, if you would like to like this video or subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, as ever, thank you very much for watching.